Okay, we're going to get started. My wife insisted I had to say something like live from New York. Here is Wednesday night. We're in Pomona, a suburb, part of the Muncie area. I told you about that, I think, before. I'm just going to start with the weekday portion, as we always do. Let me just find it here. We're in the middle of the story of Joseph and his brethren. And double check something here. Hold on a sec. I'm trying to do several things at one time, none of which I'm doing successfully. All right. First of all, of course, we're in the middle of Hanukkah, so I hope everybody's having a good Hanukkah. I'm eating so many donuts that I'm going to have to be rolled home from New York. All right, Miketz, which is this week's Torah portion, opens up with the famous dream of Pharaoh. Pharaoh has his dream. He sees first he sees seven cows that come out from the Nile, and they're very good looking, very healthy looking cows. And then seven cows that are pretty schwach, as they say in Hebrew, pretty poor looking, rise up. And then they devour the healthy, good looking ones. And he wakes up and he goes back to sleep. He has another dream. Now it's 7 ears of grain. The first 7 come up very nice looking, then another 7 that come up are looking terrible. And once again, they swallow up the good ones. And he wakes up and it doesn't change their appearance, excuse me. So nobody can figure out what it means. And then the butler, or the cupbearer to Pharaoh, remembers Joseph, and he says, well, I was in prison. There was this kid who answered all kinds of questions in regards to the dreams that we had, and it came true. So they summon Joseph from the prison and they bring him before Pharaoh, and Joseph says, it's not that I can answer, but God, Kadosh Baruch Hu, he's the one who can explain all of these things. And so he says, all right, so what is the dreams about? He says, there are going to be 7 good years, good harvest for Egypt. But then there are going to be 7 bad years. The harvest is going to be terrible. There's not going to be food to eat. And he then says, he advises Pharaoh, if you're smart, what you'll do is you'll appoint somebody to gather up the extra grain during the good years, store it up for the bad years. And then when the famine comes, you'll have what to eat. And so Pharaoh decides, well, you've given me this advice, we'll put you in charge. And that's what happens. And so Joseph is now a high official in Pharaoh's court. And so he then starts the process of gathering in the grains, etc. And then he marries and he has children, and the famine comes. And so the famine is not just in Egypt, it also spreads to other parts of the ancient Middle East, Near East. And so where Jacob and his sons are living, the famine is there. And so Jacob tells his sons, all except for Benjamin the youngest, to go to Egypt to purchase acquired grain for them. And when they come, Joseph does not look like the brother of 17 years ago. He's dressed like an Egyptian. He's probably completely shaved and bald, the head is shaved, etc., wearing Egyptian garb. And he pretends that he doesn't understand the language that they're speaking, and he has an interpreter. And it's clear that Joseph intends to test his brothers to see what kind of people they are. And so he says, you're spies, you come out to spy the land. He accuses them that, and then puts someone, they say, no, we're just honest people, come to buy grain. And he ends up taking one of the brothers, Shimon, and puts him into prison. He gives the others grain, sends them home, and says, "Don't come back unless you bring the youngest brother that you had mentioned." So they go back to Jacob, and on their way back, they discover that the money that they'd used to buy the grain in Egypt was still in their bags, mixed in with the grain. And so they get back and they bring home to Jacob and everything that they've and tell them the story. So they wait a while, and when everything is used up again, now time they need more food. And Jacob says to his sons, "You got to go back." And he says, "Well, we can't go back without Benjamin. And Jacob says, "No, I can't lose him. I already lost his older brother Joseph. He's the last of the sons that I have from my beloved Rachel. I can't let him go." But they say, "Well, if you don't let him go, we can't go back." So finally, Reuven offers his own sons as kind of security. And that's obviously a stupid thing because, after all, his sons are Jacob's grandchildren. But so Judah, in the end, says, "Look, I will be the security. I will make sure that nothing happens." And so he sends Benjamin with them. And so they go back. Joseph recognizes everybody, recognizes Benjamin. I won't go through all the details of it. But what he does once again is he prepares another test. And so after they fill their bags with grain, he has one of his servants put his cup into one the bags that belongs to Benjamin, and then chases after them. And when they catch up with them, they say somebody stole a cup from the vizier, from the official of Paro, and they all say they're innocent. And sure enough, they find it in Benjamin's bag, and so they drag Benjamin back. So all the brothers go back to confront Joseph to try and save their brother Benjamin. Very clearly, what's going on here is that Joseph knows that his brothers had been jealous of him, and that was because of his special status, and also that the status that his mother Rachel had in the eyes of their father. And so he wants to see what's going to happen with Benjamin. And this is the next week we have the completion of this story, where Joseph is convinced that indeed everything is going according to what he had hoped it would be, that the brothers have changed and indeed are concerned about the well-being of their brother Benjamin. Okay, so that's essentially it. Now, since it is also Hanukkah, and every day of Hanukkah we have a special Torah reading, so to the Shabbat there will be a special Maftir Aliyah, the additional Aliyah, which concerns the gifts of the various princes of Israel, the heads of the tribes, when the temple was, the Mishkan tabernacle was dedicated, which is chosen for the reading for Hanukkah, because the word Hanukkah has meaning of dedication. And the Mishkan was dedicated, so that therefore the rabbis chose these passages as appropriate reading for Hanukkah. And then the Haftarah, the prophetic reading, then is a reading that mentions a kind of menorah, though it's not the menorah of Hanukkah, it's not the menorah of the standard menorah in the ancient temple, but it is a 7 lamp altar stand, candle stand, and it talks about dedication to God, and that everything doesn't come just because of might, but by the word of God, which also is in keeping with the basic message that the rabbis wanted to stress for Hanukkah, that the miracle of Hanukkah is not simply the military victory that takes place, but rather it is also the fact that people have faith in God, and God helps deliver them in their time of trouble. Okay, so that is this week's Torah portion. This week and next week, we are going to be talking about Kashrut. And then the following week, we have our first exam. Okay, so be prepared for that. You only, you won't have more than 1,000 questions, I promise, on the exam. that was said with tongue in cheek. Of course, it hurts when you put your tongue in your cheek and try to talk. Okay. Let's understand a couple of things about kashrut in general, and then we'll go into some detail today, and then also next week. Also, lest I forget, I'm scheduled to be home next Wednesday night, but we are driving home on Wednesday. So if the border guards let me through, then we will have class. If they delay it, I hope I'll be there on time. Please give me at least 15 minutes leeway if I don't show up in 15 minutes, then you're certainly free to forget about the class. But God willing, I will be there by 7:30 next Wednesday night. All right, let's understand what kashrut is not. Who was that? Kashrut is not a routine to keep you healthy. Although some famous rabbinic authorities, even Maimonides, suggested that a kosher diet is a healthier diet. Many have said that some of the things that are banned under kashrut laws are unhealthy. For example, seafood, certain crustaceans can have problems in terms of infestations and get sick from them, that you can have pork can have trichinosis in it. But among the animals that are not kosher are horses. As far as I know, there's nothing particularly wrong health-wise in terms of eating a horse, though that's not the common meals that people have in North America, unless you're French, and some of the French I know apparently have eaten horse. But we don't eat horses in general. You won't go to your local McDonald's and find that there's a cheeseburger made with horse flesh. And there are other things that there's absolutely no reason why they should be considered to be unhealthy. But we will see that there's certain rules about what constitutes kosher animals, certain rules about how the kosher material has to be handled. And what is the purpose of all of this? If it's not for health, what does the Bible tell us? The Torah tells us after the at the end in Parshat Shmini, after it goes through the kosher laws, the animals that are kosher and not kosher, and a kind of a summary, it says at the end, "For I, the Lord your God, you are to sanctify yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Kadoshim to you, kadosh anochi," elsewhere it says. In other words, kashrut, for one thing, is a system of making you holy. What does it mean to make you holy? Now, we understand there are certain things that we think of as being holy. But again, what does that really mean to be holy? Now, the word in Hebrew for holy, kadosh, kuf dalet shin, the roots have the meaning actually of separate, distinct. That which is holy is separate and distinct. And that is used in a number of ways. For example, one of the terms for temple prostitutes. A kadesha is a woman who was a temple prostitute. Her activities were dedicated to the polytheistic ideas of their day. And sexual relations with such an individual was actually a methodology of worshiping God, or the pagan gods. So kadosh has a meaning of separate, distinct. And when one observes kashrut, if one is careful to observe kashrut, it demands a certain kind of separation, a certain distinction in your life. Because it's kind of hard in North America to go to a corner restaurant and have it be kosher. There are kosher restaurants in Toronto, not that many, and certainly not in every corner. You go to the ball games. I believe these days there is a kosher hot dog stand at the stadium, but many places do not have kosher hot dogs available. So there's a certain distinctness of that comes about of keeping kosher. And certainly one of the aspects of that is that it will, to some extent, create a barrier between Jew and non-Jew. After all, if you can't eat together, that creates a certain kind of boundary. And be honest with you, part of the rationale behind that originally, and still is, that it makes for interactions between Jews and non-Jews a little more difficult than they would be otherwise. And the purpose of that, as many of the rabbis explained over the ages, was, to be honest with you again, to make it harder for Jews and non-Jews to get together and marry. Because if you can't eat together, you can't share meals together, the likelihood of intermarriage is going to go down. That is a reality of behind some of the rules that we're going to learn about later during the course of this. We live in an age in which we want people to be able to celebrate together, to be together. But right now we're in the middle of the holiday of Hanukkah, which once again emphasizes distinctiveness, differences between Jew and non-Jew. And so one of the ways, if you're going to maintain your identity as a separate and distinct people, a religion, then you're going to put limits on the kind of socialization you can have. So that's certainly part and parcel of it, as certainly as interpreted later on. Torah itself doesn't say that. The Torah itself says you're supposed to be holy. God is holy, you shall be holy. And so we begin with that premise, and then we go from there. Just want to try something. I don't like the way my picture looks, at least to me on this screen, but I don't know how this will do it any better. No, that's much better, that light in the ceiling here. It's not very level. There we go. Okay. I hope that's a little bit better. I don't know. Okay. So now, what does it mean to keep kosher? First of all, we start with the idea that the Torah says that there are certain animals that are regarded as being proper to eat, fit for eating, and other animals that are not. And in a couple of places in the Torah, we're given some of these descriptions. One of them is found in Leviticus. In chapter 11 of Leviticus, Vadaber Hashem el Moshe v'Aaron lemor, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Alehem, to them, Dabru el b'nei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel anymore, saying, Zot hachaya asher tochlu mikol habehema asher ala oretz. These are the animals that you shall eat amongst all the beasts that are on the earth. Kol mafreset parsa v'shasat shasa parsa ma'aleh gerat. So it says the animals have to be cloven hoofed. They have to have a hoof which is split. If you ever look at a cow's hoof, essentially the cow's hoof is a combination of two toes that are put together, and that makes the hoof. It's split like this, all right? So it's completely split. Not quite the Vulcan sign, all right? All right. But that eliminates any animal that doesn't have that kind of split hoof. So for example, I mentioned earlier, the horse. The horse doesn't have a split hoof, okay? Now, there are some that do have split hoofs that aren't kosher. The pig. What's wrong with the pig? Well, there are two identifying marks for the kosher animal. Cloven hoof or split hoof, and chewing its cud. Farmers out here know that what does it mean chewing your cud? It means it's an animal that eats grass and grains. And the cellulose of the grass is very difficult to digest. And what ruminants do is they chew the grass, swallow it, it goes into a stomach, begins the digestive process, and then it brings it back up and it chews it again. That's chewing its cud. And now the initial digestive process has already begun, and now the secondary process is done the second time. That's what secondary means, obviously. Allows for the animal to be able to digest the grass. All right, so in order to be a kosher animal, a land animal, it must have a cloven hoof and chew its cud. Anything else is not a kosher land animal. Okay. First of all, we eliminate all non-mammalians. It's not a mammal, it's not a kosher animal. I'm not talking about birds right now. Amongst the mammalians, it has to have a cloven hoof. If it doesn't have a cloven hoof, it's not kosher. And it must be an animal that not only has a cloven hoof, but also chews its cud, making it into sheep, goats, lambs. It's that type of animal. Bears are not kosher. We said horses are not kosher. Pigs are not kosher. The moose is kosher. Bison, American buffalo, bison is kosher. These are all kosher animals. There's more to it than that, but that's the first thing is if it walks on land, cloven hoof, and chew its cud. If either sign is missing, it is not considered to be a kosher animal.
So would that include like a giraffe?
Giraffes, there's some difference of opinion, but a giraffe apparently is a kosher animal. The joke is, the problem is you don't know where to do the slaughtering because where on the neck you're supposed to cut the throat. But the giraffe, yes, is technically, according to most opinions, a kosher animal. Any other questions? All right.
Thanks.
But apparently there's some kind of club, supper club kind of thing in Israel that they have this exotic meals in which they find these animals that normally you're not going to find on any kosher menu. I mean, they're kosher, but you're not going to find them. So they had giraffe at one of these meals. I don't know. It doesn't sound to me very enticing, but all right. Okay. All right. So now, if it does, all right. So now, anything that is in water, right? Every creature that lives in the water, whether it be salt water or it be regular the water, lake water, non-salt water, what does that have to do? That has to have fins and scales. If it does not have fins, those little floppy things on the side, right? I guess they're more like this, I don't know. That swims around with. And scales, those are the things that protect its body. We'll come back to more detail in that in a moment. If it doesn't have those two, the Hebrew word is simanim, signs, evidence of being kosher, then it is not a kosher animal to be eaten. So that leaves automatically all crustaceans, shrimp, crab, lobster are forbidden. Sharks, sea mammals. Sea mammals, well, they're not fish at all. And they don't have scales at all. They do have fins of some, maybe you may consider those fins, but they certainly don't have scales. The shark has scales, but the only way to remove the scales from a shark is to tear the flesh. So the shark is not considered to be kosher. There are many different fish that there's uncertainty about some of them, whether they're kosher or not. There are lists that you can find online on what are considered to be the most accepted kosher species. And sometimes there are different opinions. Did I send you the story about the swordfish? All right, you see, sometimes you get caught up in all kinds of issues. Sometimes they're with definition. Is this a kosher scale or not a kosher scale? And sometimes the reality is, we'll see later on, is that struggles over power and power of interpretation enter into the whole mix. And sometimes things have changed over the generations. During the Middle Ages, there was a great deal of dispute over the status of sturgeon. Many traditional authorities accepted the kashrut of sturgeon. Today, most authorities do not accept the kashrut status of sturgeon. That's why you can't have the caviar that is the beluga caviar. Because if it's anything that you eat, if it comes from an animal, the animal itself must be kosher, or you cannot consume it. So, example, you can have milk from a cow because the cow is a kosher animal. You cannot have the milk from a pig or horse. Those are not kosher animals. So
Can I
therefore,
ask?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask. You said a couple times today, most authorities, like when you were referring to the giraffe, where you cut on the neck, or in the case of like sturgeon. So are there like groups of like recognized Jewish communities that follow an authority that allows them to eat beluga caviar, for example? Or is it just that there's some dissent?
There is some, no, in the conservative movement, if I recall, there were some voices that permitted sturgeon. And that's based upon the medieval identification. And within the conservative movement, you will find some that are more lenient and more restrictive. We'll talk about that, especially when we come to milk and wine later on. But here's the reality in the kosher world is this. Part of what goes on is that to be kosher, usually we expect in the modern age that somebody supervises the production of the animal's meat. If we're talking about animals, if it's things that are made in a factory in some way, vegetables and things like that, there has to be a certain degree of supervision. And the supervisors of these things tend to be the most traditionalist, narrowest in terms of their interpretation. Because if everybody agrees that something is not kosher, no problem. If there's some difference of opinion as to whether an item is kosher or not, you want to have the widest clientele for your product, right? So if you have the most stringent position giving you kosher supervision, that's hechsher. That's the symbols I sent out, a list of some of those. Then, even if you are more lenient and you might be prepared to eat caviar, for example, you're certainly not going to object to the fact that there's some rabbi who gives a hechsher permission to eat caviar or roe that comes from salmon. That's the usual substitute for caviar, right? Generally speaking, the more stringent the authority, the more widely accepted their position will be. Right? Even if somebody disagrees with them, that they're prepared to be more lenient, they're generally not going to turn them away from the fact that they're more stringent. Right? So I try to use my words carefully. The conservative movement as a whole tends to be much more lenient. We will see, like you said, we'll talk about cheeses later on. We'll talk about wine later on. There are voices within the conservative movement that permitted sturgeon. Certainly you saw from Rabbi Klein, Isaac Klein of blessed memory, who was not a liberal in that sense. He was not a lenient interpreter of Jewish law. He was an important member of the conservative rabbinate. but he did permit swordfish. And he is certainly an authority that one can rely upon, although most in the Orthodox world will not eat swordfish. Part of the problem with these issues is that everybody has, we call it looking over your right shoulder. You know, if you want to be taken seriously, you're more concerned about the people to your right than to your left. Because the people to your right are the ones who are going to tell their members, their congregants, you can't follow what Rabbi X says because he's too lenient. Right? You don't generally run into an issue unless someone says, oh, Rabbi X is too stringent, therefore you can't accept what he says. Okay? I hope that, I think it was Corey that was asking, wasn't it? Okay? So, you know, these things do exist, and I try to give you the gamut as I go through it. But if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I don't know if you wave the hand signal on it, if I'll see it or not. Maybe I will. I don't know, because I can only see a few faces on my tablet, unlike at home. So if you unmute yourself and yell out at me and say, Rabbi Berman, that's fine too.
Rabbi
Okay.
Berman.
Yes.
So, quick question for you. So for these different rules, right, regarding kashrut, like for example, the fish, right, regarding scales,
Yeah.
is this, not to sound ignorant, but is this like in the Torah, or is this just like different rabbis' interpretation of it?
Okay. Right now, what I've been telling you straight from the Torah itself sets these rules, fins and scales. I just quoted that right straight from the Torah. The interpretation is where we start to get into issues. For example, let's take the sturgeon. The sturgeon is a different kind of fish for sure. It's a very old fish in terms of on the line of evolution. Apparently, if you take the sturgeon has scales, but if you try to scale it normally, if any of you are fishermen or any of you have scaled a fish, you know, you run the knife or the scaling device across it against the scales come off very easily, and you don't tear the flesh of the fish. You can't do that with a sturgeon when you take it out of the water. But if you put it into boiling water, you then can scale it. So does that count as kosher scales? And that was a big debate in the Middle Ages. Majority opinion from the Middle Ages was it doesn't count. Sharks, as far as I know, you can't do anything to allow you to scale it without tearing the flesh of the shark. So there's no one of the opinion that the shark is kosher. There is a majority opinion in the more traditional world, overwhelming majority in the more traditional world, that sturgeon is not kosher. A minority opinion based upon that medieval dispute that says it's kosher. So often, yes, we have a rule of the Torah, and then there is a difference of interpretation. How you interpret that rule may vary. And that's what makes the world go round. That's the Jewish way of arguing over whether it's kosher or not, or whether it goes this way or that way. And if we didn't have those arguments, we wouldn't have the Talmud. And then all the rabbis would have nothing to read. Okay? So, if it lives in the water, common fish that you are aware of, flounder, bass, salmon, most species of tuna are kosher fish, perch, kosher fish. And it comes to northerns, pickerel, walleye, trout, all these are examples of kosher fish. all right, when we come to slaughtering, we'll have to touch about that when it comes to the fish versus the animals. Okay. So now we've taken care of land animals. We've taken care of fish. The last thing that we have of living creatures that we consume, or if you do consume, and you're not a vegetarian, are fowl. Now, the Torah doesn't really say what constitutes a kosher bird. What it actually does is it gives us a list of non-kosher birds. Right? So a little bit later on in Leviticus, what I was reading before, where is it? After we get through with everything about the fish, right? Everything that does not have fins and scales in the water, it is an abomination to you. So the next line in the Torah says, these shall you abominate. I don't like that translation, but Yeshua says, these are the ones you avoid from among the birds. They may not be eaten. They are abomination. Okay, that's the opening of the section. That what follows is a list of birds. The problem is we don't necessarily know from the Hebrew what these birds are. Some attempt to translate them. Some can identify them. Nesher, for example, as being an eagle. Others, there's some question as to what bird they're referring to. And then amongst the birds, we find mention of Atalef, and the Atalef is understood today as being a bat, and certainly the bat is not a bird, but it flies around, and we'll talk about locusts in a minute. Okay, so the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud tried to analyze on the basis of what they understood these birds to be, to try and develop some kind of basic rule to guide you. And there are some rules that you'll find, but it's very difficult to really apply those rules. And so what happens is that it became the practice was that if a bird was recognized by a Jewish community over the generations to be kosher, it was kosher. If it was not recognized by the Jewish community to be a kosher bird, it wasn't kosher. So most, rapiers, hawks and eagles and those kinds of birds and cormorants, those are which eat other birds as well as mammals, little things like that. Those are certainly not kosher. But the identity of the other birds is very difficult. And so essentially what is come about is that there's an accepted tradition that chicken-like birds are kosher. When you come to a community where it has a kind of bird that looks like a chicken, but it's not a chicken, it's slightly different species, well, then it becomes a question, is that a kosher chicken or is it not a kosher chicken? When the American turkey, turkeys are native to North America. They weren't in Europe. And they're, how can you say they're kosher? There's no Jewish community that has had hundreds of years of eating turkey because nobody knew what a turkey was until the turkey came out. So there are some Jews who will not eat a turkey today. Others accept the identification as turkey is clearly like, sort of like chickens. Or somewhere along the line. In Hebrew, it's called an tarnagolet hodu, an Indian chicken, and what have you. So unless the 10 lost tribes constitute the ancestry of North American Aboriginals, there were no Jewish community that ate turkey, but most Jews in the world accepted turkey as being a kosher bird. And clearly there's room there for all kinds of arguments over various kinds of birds out there. But we know that the majority of what people generally eat, domesticated fowl, are kosher. Birds, chickens, domesticated ducks, domesticated geese are regarded as being kosher. I don't know about Canadian geese. They could be kosher or not. I don't know. Somebody ought to go around and get rid of some of them anyway. Too many of them flop around in certain areas. But pheasants, a number of other birds are generally accepted as being kosher. But I don't advise going out into the woods and hunting down trapping some birds and looking at them and saying, oh, it's a kosher bird, I can eat it. Now, one other category, which nobody here on this video is ever going to eat, are locusts. There are certain kinds of locusts that are described as being kosher. And there's some descriptions of them, and we won't go into it. And at least until the modern era, Jews of Yemen would still eat certain locusts. But generally speaking, you don't need to worry about that. You're not going to come to any kosher menus that have locusts on them. So relax on that. Although I see now people are talking about, maybe we should start raising crickets for people to eat good protein. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens with that. But crickets aren't locusts, so that's another problem. And I'm not even going to touch upon right now whether or not you can have a steak that was made from cells taken from a non-kosher steak and grown in a test tube. That's for much later on. All right. So 3 categories of animal life. Walk on 4s on land, have to have cloven hoof, chew its cud. And they are all obviously mammals. If it lives in water, fins and scales, that eliminates all shellfish, and that eliminates all sea mammals. Birds, you have to rely upon the standard accepted kosher birds. Okay, so that's step 1. Step number 2, the animal's alive. You have to slaughter it in some manner. Now, when it comes to birds and it comes to cattle, the prescribed procedure essentially is the major arteries in the neck are cut, thus cutting off the blood supply almost immediately to the brain, thus causing about pretty much almost instantaneous death with as little suffering as possible on the animal. The process for cattle used to be that they would have to take the animal and get it down on the ground, and then to cut the what do you call it, simanim? I'm trying to think what they call it in English right now, just need for the Hebrew. But it's esophagus and in the carotid artery. And it has to be done in a smooth action. The knife that is used has to be sharp, may not have any nicks, is not allowed to be able to catch, to tear the flesh. It must be able to cut through it smoothly in a 1-2 stroke. If that is not done, the animal is rendered what we call treif or nevela. Right? And here's where we run it when it's foul, it's a similar kind of process, although there's only one siman that has to be cut. When it comes to cattle, sheep, goats, most non-kosher slaughtering today requires either stunning or it's killed by shooting it in the brain. not with a gun, but a device that does so. That is not considered to be kosher. And so kosher slaughtering does not, at least at this time in history, does not permit an animal to be stunned before slaughtering. And that's where you may find certain kinds of disputes that we see that in Europe, which is banning kosher and halal slaughtering for Muslims, because the Muslims and Jews both insist upon slaughtering the animal in a similar manner. And that's creating a problem for Jewish communities in parts of Europe, and it pops up in North America from time to time as well. Is it possible that sometime in the future that there might be a way of accepting that? I don't know. I don't think so, but sometimes necessity creates certain kinds of openings for interpretation. It's slaughtered at the neck because that allows also for as much blood to leave the body as quickly as possible. Because the Torah says we're not allowed to eat the blood of an animal. That's the life of the animal. The very life force of the animal itself is its blood. And so, first of all, it's slaughtered in a manner to allow the blood to come out. Then, when the animal is prepared, immediately the flesh has to be rinsed and salted. Salt is put on to draw out the blood, the remaining blood that's in the animal. Certain organs are generally not kosher. Kidneys, for example, are. The heart is, but it has to be cut open and to make sure that all blood is drained out of it. Certain sinews are not regarded as being kosher, certain fats. And the biggest problem with that is we read a couple of weeks ago about Jacob wrestling with the angel. And it says in that passage that Jews do not consume the sciatic nerve. That's where Jacob was injured, according to the biblical account. The sciatic nerve, it runs by the hind quarter. Well, we have our own hindquarters. If you have sciatica, I pity you. All right? It's a very painful discomfort. And it runs along the hind quarter by the back leg of animals. It can be removed through an act called trevering. But to do it, you have to cut through the flesh. It's very time consuming. It's a very difficult process. And it leaves certain parts of the meat in a condition that is not considered to be ideal for merchandising. For example, you can't have a whole T-bone steak that's been trevered and the sciatic nerve removed because it runs through that part of the steak. Similarly, all right. So while you can find in some communities where they do the process of trevering the meat, removing these sinews, for the most part, the expense and time involved with it just does not make it economical. So therefore, in North America, generally speaking, what happens is if you have a kosher slaughterhouse, the only part of the animal, would be cows or it be goats or sheep, that is used is the front quarter. The hindquarters are automatically sent to a non-kosher facility. So that you won't find your T-bones and sirloin steaks in the kosher meat sections. Okay. So the animal is slaughtered. Hindquarters we don't use. Certain sinews and things that are even in the front quarters are removed, certain veins. The meat is salted, and then you can consume it. We'll come back to, I don't want to forget about certain exceptions to that rule, and especially dealing with barbecue. All right. Birds are similar. The issue is less in with birds, but there's certain things that have to be removed from the carcass of a bird. Now, fish were not slaughtered for the altar. So there is no prerequisite of how you have to slaughter a fish. The fish just have to be slaughtered, or they die when you bring them in. If you have a cow, for example, and the cow drops down dead, you can't use it. If you catch a fish and you throw it in your bucket and the fish dies, you can use it. Right? So that's a big difference between fish and birds and cattle. There's no prescribed methodology of slaughter. So now one more major factor that we have to be concerned with, and that is that 3 times in the Torah, it says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. You shall not cook, boil literally, a goat, in its mother's milk. Now, one could take that very straightforward literally and say, okay, when you cook your goats, your kids, make sure you don't cook them in their mother's milk. Use somebody else's milk, okay, but not their own mother's milk. Okay? But that's not how the rabbis understood it, and it's repeated 3 times. And every time you have something that seems to be repetitive in the Torah, the rabbis understood that to mean it's teaching you different things. So the 3-partite repetition of Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, not to cook a kid in his mother's milk, was understood meaning we're not allowed to cook any milk and meat together. We're not allowed to eat it together, nor are we even allowed to have any benefit from meat and milk being put together, cooked together. Okay? So it becomes, in Jewish tradition, a total ban of consuming dairy products with meat products. So therefore, we traditionally, we have separate utensils for cooking dairy and meat. We have separate plates and cutlery for consuming meat and dairy products. And we're careful to make sure they never have an admixture between the two. Mm-hmm. So the idea behind it, well, Maimonides famously suggested that there was a pagan practice, a fertility rite, to indeed take a young animal and cook it in its own mother's milk. He took it very literally, the source for that. And as with much of the Torah, Maimonides understands it as a means of separating us from paganism. There's some debate whether or not there indeed was such a practice, but regardless of that, we don't do it. Now, some want to say there's a certain sense here. How can you take an animal and consume it in the very milk that was used to feed it, to give it life? And some see it that way as kind of a message to us in terms of a certain sense of sensitivity. Just like we're not allowed to slaughter an animal and its young and consume them on the same day. Same sort of idea behind it. Now, the separation between the two becomes different customs. Everyone agrees that after you consume meat product, you have to wait a period of time before you can consume a dairy product. And different discussions of that, some suggest because of meal practices, some want to relate it to digestive reality, so that the customs arose that essentially is between meals. You couldn't have a dairy meal immediately following a meat meal. You had to wait till the dairy time, till your dairy meal that's going to come up. What does that mean? Well, if you ate lunch at noon and you normally eat dinner at 6, there you get 6-hour separation time between the two. And that was a fairly standard Eastern European waiting period, either 6 hours or 5 hours entering into the 6th hour after you finished your meal. The German Jews, perhaps because of their practices and meal practices and what have you, waited 3 hours. Sephardic Jews tend to wait 6 hours. Now, the reverse is a question. Do you have to wait a period of time after consuming dairy before you can consume meat? And that is, again, different practices. Some say as long as you rinse out your mouth and you make sure there's no residue in your mouth of the dairy product, then you go right ahead and consume a meat product. Many follow that who have the practice, and there's a practice that we'll talk about later in the year about having dairy products on Shavuot, on the holiday of Shavuos. But there's also a statement in the Talmud, Ein simcha ela b'basar v'yayin, you can't have real joy without meat and wine. And some insist you can't have a real Yom Tov meal if it's not meat. So in order to observe the custom of having dairy on Shavuot, they'll eat something that's dairy, and then wait a couple of minutes, rinse the mouth out, maybe good excuse to have a nice bit of schnapps, a little bit of l'chaim, some wine, or good bourbon, or for those who like the lesser stuff, some scotch, between the dairy and the meat, and then you have consume your meat meal. I'm a bourbon man, yeah, obviously. It's any case. All right. So again, you can consult with your rabbi for guidance on all of that. Now, there's also, many different issues about what constitutes the health of a kosher animal in terms of Jewish law. If an animal has a wound of some kind, that the rabbis consider it to be a fatal wound, even if it's not fatal immediately. For example, if there is a hole in a lung, or if there is a needle in certain parts of the animal's digestive system, these are considered to be items that cause an animal to be called a treifa. Treifa literally means an animal that's been torn. And it's referred to in the Bible as an animal. You go out in the woods and you find a deer that the bear had gotten at and tore it, or a wolf had gotten at it and they tore it. That's a treifa according to that. The word treifa here, as I'm using it, it means that the animal had some kind of injury or internal unusual aspect of part of their organs that rabbinic tradition understood would be lethal within a year. That animal is declared a treifa. So when you have your cow that is slaughtered, one of the major things that they do is they check the lungs to be sure there's no perforations in the lung. If there's any perforation in the lung, then the animal is declared treif and it cannot be used for kosher consumption. If there's certain scar tissue on the lung, there are some leniencies allowing you to examine that. Today, most slaughterhouses follow a more stricter standard, what we call galat from the Eastern European, Yiddish meaning smooth, that there's absolutely no adhesions on the lungs in order to declare it kosher. All right? That's where the concept of galat kosher comes from. It doesn't mean super kosher, it means originally that the lung had no adhesions on it whatsoever. Similarly, there's certain things that you have foul if that the animal has to meet certain standards. If those standards are not there, then the animal is not considered to be kosher. Okay. Now, one other area of eating consumption, of course, is grains and vegetables. All grains, all vegetables, at least in a raw state, are kosher. If it grows from a tree or from the ground, or whatever, it's kosher. It doesn't have to have any special rules associated with it. Once it's processed, then you have to make sure that one, no dairy product coming in contact with it, or no animal fats were used in the processing. You can't go and buy a can of pork and beans, even if the pork is not there in the beans anymore. Right? So if you go and buy raw vegetables, all raw vegetables are fine. Once it's been processed, it depends upon the nature of the processing. If it's just canned beans or canned peas, that sort of thing, is usually not an issue. But if it's anything beyond that, if there's something involved in cooking it up, let's say tomato sauce, which has got other ingredients thrown into it, well, then it becomes an issue. So that's where the whole idea of a hechsher comes from. When you buy processed products, when you buy meat, obviously you're either going to be going to a kosher butcher shop, or you go to a section of the grocery store that has kosher meats, and it will all have some kind of symbol on it indicating that this is indeed a kosher piece of meat. Okay? And the local kashrut organization, COR, C-O-R, operates out of Toronto, and it is the major local kashrut authority. There are many others. Some of the nationally known ones are the OK or Circle K, the OU, Star K, as well as COR, and there are other important ones that are out there. These organizations all certify that the product that you are buying meets their standards. Now, there may be various standards they might have, but they do let you know what their standards are. And you can certainly rely upon them to make sure that no non-kosher product gets mixed in. And if something happens, for example, not long ago, there was a notice about a product that certain of the company's products were kosher and some were not kosher. And they put a kosher sign on the non-kosher product. So COR took away all of their kosher supervision. They said nothing else. We're not going to supervise at all. If the kosher consumer should not eat or consume these products because we can't rely upon them treating it responsibly. And the way this works is that COR or OU or Circle K or Star K, these are all symbols that are registered. They're protected by copyright registration laws. And if you use it without their permission, you can be fined. You can pay a penalty. And that's what makes the power to them. They can go to court and say, look, they are using an unauthorized symbol of kashrut from us. They were not permitted to do so. And we seek damages from the company. And so while it's a religious concept, the idea of the protection of the symbol allows it to be enforced in the civil courts. So that's an important matter. Now, sometimes products, it's less today, but it used to be more, will have the letter K on it saying it's kosher. But that doesn't mean anything because you don't know, it's not a protected letter of the alphabet. You don't know why it's there. You don't know who says it is kosher. And therefore, it's not a very reliable way of dealing with kashrut. And so most kosher consumers will not buy something that simply has the letter K on it. Now, there were some for many years that was accepted. Kraft products, Kraft cheese, cottage cheese, for example, not cottage cheese, but cream cheese, was known to be a kosher cream cheese. They just, for whatever reason, they didn't have the OU on it. They had the letter K. And everybody knew that, and so that was fine. Today, I believe they all have the OU on it. So why do you have to have a kosher marking on cheese? Well, there are two things. One, and it used to be the question was to make sure that was only kosher milk used in it. there was the fear in the Middle Ages and even earlier that if you were to go to your local farmer and buy a bucket of milk, and he didn't have enough cow's milk or he didn't have enough goat's milk, and he happened to have a mare who was pregnant and had a foal, or he's got a pig with extra milk in him, they finish up the bucket with the milk from the pig or from the non-kosher source. So the demand was that in order to have milk be kosher, a Jew had to supervise the milking of the animal to make sure that no admixtures were put in. That is called Chalav Yisrael, Jewish milk, for lack of a better way of translating. And up until the modern era, that was pretty much the only way you could have milk, was to make sure that somebody who was Jewish supervised the milking of that animal. Now, in North America, we have these large dairies and we have production lines and all of that. And back in the 1930s, one of the important one of the important Orthodox rabbis in the 1930s, Rav Moshe Feinstein, was asked, is it okay for an observant Jew to drink just regular milk? Go to the grocery store and buy whatever carton of milk that was there. And his answer was yes. He knows that there are government rules and regulations as to what can be in the milk product. You're not allowed to add stuff. It has to come from a cow. So if you have no other choice, you can do so. He prefers you to buy what they call Chalav Yisrael. But if not, and many Jews who are observant of Kashrut will buy milk without a hechsher on it, because we know that the likelihood of anybody playing games with milk is very small, because they're getting much more trouble than having a bunch of rabbis on them. They have the federal government on top of them if they play games with milk.
Rabbi Berman?
Yes.
Just have a quick question on that comment. So if you need to slaughter a cow in order to determine if it is in fact kosher by examining the lungs, how can you know whether any milk is actually kosher?
A good question. And the answer to that is you can't. In a sense, you're right. If the cow was found to be a treifa, for whatever reason, you milked the cow and then you slaughtered the cow, and after you slaughtered the cow, you found out it was a treifa, you couldn't drink the milk. But first of all, we don't really drink milk from one cow anymore. It's always mixed with lots of other cows' milk. And we'll have to talk about nullification in quantity in a while. So the likelihood of you getting milk coming from a treif cow is very minuscule. And if it's so minuscule, you don't need to worry about it. But it's a good question. It could be a problem. But in today's world, it's not really. If you own your own farm and you milk your cows, make sure you finish up your milk before you slaughter the cow to see, but you don't usually slaughter the cows that you're milking. All right. The cows that no longer produce milk, those are the ones that get slaughtered. All right. So usually not an issue, because you don't know when it becomes a treifa. You can, unless it was something from very beginning of its life, it had some kind of malformation in its entire lifetime. In which case, since it didn't die within a year, one might argue it really wasn't a treifa to start with. Okay? All right, so that's with milk. Now, when it comes to cheese, it's a little bit more complicated. And that's because cheese needs a coagulant. You take milk and you put something in it that makes the cheese come about. And the easiest way of doing that was to take part of the stomach of a calf that had been slaughtered, and it produces the enzymes to make the milk usable by the animal, and you put it into the milk. And these enzymes cause the milk to coagulate and create your cheese. Or you pour the milk into the stomach of a calf to make your cheese. And there are issues of kashrut and the source of the rennet as it was called, rennet. So that always was an issue. Today, most rennet, all kosher cheeses use rennet that is not from an animal source. And so there's no kashrut issues whatsoever with the cheese. If it's not kosher cheese with a hechsher on it saying it was done that way, there are questions as to whether or not, what kind of rennet was used, how it got there. Here's a case where, again, Rabbi Isaac Klein permitted the consumption of standard North American produced cheese because he felt that the rennet that was used it was really undergoes a lot of chemical processing of the original enzyme from the calf, and that rendered it really like a new product altogether. And so he permitted cheeses that were made in North America for that reason. There are Orthodox rabbis too who would say so, but they're hesitant to do that. That's tied in with economics and all kinds of other issues. Again, talk to your rabbi about that. And even with cheese, some cheese is made with regular milk, just like we just described it. Others are only made with milk that is Chalav Yisrael, milk that comes from a source that was supervised by rabbis to make sure that its origins were not problematic. So when it comes to cheeses, when it comes to any processed milk product, you have to be careful if it's an issue of going beyond simply turning it into butter, or just which is just the butter fat that's skimmed off and then churned, to be sure that it doesn't have any kinds of things in it. Artificial products. Well, today, most of them are clearly designed to make sure there is no meat or animal product in it, because they want it to be vegan, they want it to be totally dairy, they want it to be for people who are total vegetarians. And so usually it's not really a problem, but many of the authorities still would insist that we always have a hechsher on the artificial products to be sure that there's no dairy in it, because there might be a amount of dairy that's in it that they find is okay, but might not meet our standards. Eggs. Eggs must come from kosher birds. It's not, today you go to the grocery store, unlikely to find too many eggs that aren't from plain old chickens. Unless you go to specialty store that might have pheasant's eggs or that sort of thing. Used to be a problem was that, you had the local farmer, he had his chickens, they laid eggs, the chicken farmer had his rooster, and the rooster might impregnate the hen, and the eggs might have started to turn into chicks. And so if you opened an egg and you found a blood spot on it, it was considered now to be beyond simply the stage of being an egg, and it was already beginning to be the introduction of embryo. Once it becomes the introduction of embryo, it was no longer considered to be kosher to be eaten that way. Today, it's really not an issue. Some people are very stringent when they use eggs to make sure there are no blood spots, but if there's a blood spot on an egg today, really there's nothing to worry about, because all the chicken, these hens, no roosters come near them. They don't, the factories where the hens are don't want that. So that is not an issue. When you buy fish, you have to, there's some are very more stringent than others. If you go to a kosher store or kosher supervised fish store, there's no issue. If you want to go and get your fish somewhere else, first of all, you got to be sure that it is indeed a kosher fish. So once it's been filleted, you can't necessarily know what the source is. And we know that restaurants have cheated a lot in that department, at least prior to COVID, selling fish that's one kind of fish and claiming it's another kind of fish. So it's not unknown to that to take place. So therefore, if you buy fish, say you, I went to the market once in what's the downtown, the big market there. Anyway, we went there once. So
St. Lawrence Market.
yeah. So we saw the fish. It had its fins and scales, and brought it home, and I filleted it. And if there's any parts of it that may have become in contact with a knife that wasn't a kosher knife, I just trimmed that pieces off of the fish, and there was no problem. I keep thinking there's a very nice Chinese grocery store in the neighborhood here that have live fish. I keep debating whether or not to go buy fish there one of these days. And I'll just tell them, I'll take care of you. You gut it, you chop off the head and scale it and gut it, and I'll take care of the rest. You could do that as long as you know what the fish is. If it's frozen fish and things like that, then it becomes a question of sourcing and things like that. And again, there's some more stringent, less stringent. You talk to your rabbi. If it's cooked fish, fried fish and all that, then there are other issues that have to be resolved.
If you were to buy a fish, like a live fish at the market, and then have them like take the head off and scale it for you, would it have to be somewhere that doesn't also do that with like shellfish or something?
No, what it could be is you just where the knife comes into actual contact with the flesh, you trim that little bit off.
Okay.
If you got a nice filleting knife, if you're a fisherman at all, you got a nice sharp filleting knife, right?
Yeah.
I don't do that. Anyway, so you trim the part right where they cut off where the head was, and you might trim off a little bit along the belly, and then it would be fine, because that's all the knife comes into contact with. That's not, and it's a cold knife. The rules of knives are a little different, but essentially it's a cold utensil, and therefore that's all you really would have to do for the fish. That's my opinion. You can talk to others, and I'm sure somebody tell you no if you want to find somebody to tell you no, but I think most would say it's okay that way. So that's with your fish, your meat, your eggs, your dairy products, your anything that is processed generally has to have a hechsher. Now, most kosher establishments today have what we call a mashgiach. Mashgiach is a supervisor, a kosher supervisor. And most of the time what that means is that the individual, mostly men, but there are women supervisors as well, mashgichot, comes in whenever they want to. They have to be able to come in at any time. They have to be able to examine any products that are brought into that place of business. If they get meat, they are supposed to be there if it's, say, they're processing meat itself. When the quarters are delivered, should be there when the quarters are delivered, or at least be able to check up and see that you got the bill of sale for this meat from this company, and that matches up how much meat you've got. They go through all those kinds of things to make sure that nobody's cheating. Because the fact of the matter is, there are cheats in the world. There have been numerous occasions where people have cheated. Human beings are human beings, and kosher meat costs more than non-kosher meat. Kosher birds cost more than non-kosher birds because of the supervision and all these other things that are involved with it. And so some people cut corners. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes accidental. I've heard stories about, there's a restaurant, and the restaurant, they ran out of something. And so one of the people in the back goes to the local grocery store and buys the wrong product and brings it in, and it's not a kosher product. That's happened. It's not intentional by the owners, but things like that have known to happen. And that's you got to be careful with that. That's the job of the mashgiach. The mashgiach is to make sure accidents don't happen and try to prevent subterfuge. If somebody wants to have subterfuge, that's harder to protect against, but it's done, and sometimes it gets through. We had a case a few years ago about a cheese service, a delivery that was bringing in non-kosher cheese, and was found out, and they lost their hechsher. That happens periodically for different places. One thing that I skipped in the question that nobody asked is, when was the last time you milked a bird? Right? Nobody milks birds. Nobody milks chickens. How come you can't have chicken with milk? After all, it's not its mother doesn't produce milk. And as a matter of fact, we know the Talmud itself says that there was a Jewish community in the Talmudic era, the Mishnaic era, that the local rabbi permitted dairy products with fowl. But the majority of the rabbis said no, and basically not because it's really not permitted from the Torah, but because people are more likely to make mistakes. We treat fowl, chicken, just like we treat meat. We kind of put it into that same category. And even if you're not Jewish, you know, there's dairy, there's milk and cheese and all those things, and then there's beef and there's chicken and pork, for that matter. All right, that's a different category. So they'll get all lumped together. And so as a protective device, we don't allow milk and fowl together. Although theoretically, if there's a mixture, I don't know, we won't get to it tonight, but there are certain leniencies that we have dealing with accidental mixtures of fowl and dairy products. Trying to think, I touched all the major bases. I think I have.
Rabbi Berman,
Yes.
sorry, a quick question for you. So to understand this correctly, would you say like leg of lamb is not kosher then? Because you were talking about the sciatic and everything.
You're not going to, as far as I know, you're not going to find a kosher source for leg of lamb, because it's the hind leg. You can have shank bone, front leg, front quarter. And I like that on Pesach. On Pesach, we buy shank bone, put it on our Seder plate, and then have it for lunch on the second day of Pesach. But leg of lamb, you're not going to find. Sirloin steaks, T-bone steaks, you're not going to find. Okay. The kosher butchers will tell you can substitute this meat or that meat for it and kind of get away with it, but I'm told it doesn't really work. We don't know. Right? But the whole world of kashrut is a world in which there's a lot of money that's involved. Right? The kosher consumers, we spend money. I'm visiting here in New York with my son and daughter-in-law and their 7 children. Right? Believe me, their meat bills are not low when they have meat. Right? The dairy bill's not low either. So the kashrut world is one of cutthroat competition sometimes. And sometimes not the nicest people get involved with it. And that's why this whole issue of supervision becomes very important. And I know of a case, a friend of mine who supervised a bakery who in Staten Island, who decided he was not going to allow it anymore. He said they're not doing right, they're doing certain things they shouldn't be doing. And he was visited by somebody who said, don't talk about this. And the person who visited him was not, just a friendly messenger. He was a guy who was a deadly messenger. Okay? So those things do happen. There have been certainly very major attempts at cheating products and things like that. And there are accidents. When I was a rabbi in a community in Texas, I was the only traditional rabbi in town. There was a Reform rabbi, there was myself. And I had to supervise the bakery. And I would go into the bakery and I would find, I remember one time I found 4 different containers of oil. One container just had vegetable oil, no indication of anything beyond that. Another container said vegetable oil. It had the letter K on it. Third container of oil had I think it was OU. And the fourth was clearly not kosher, completely not kosher. It had lard in it. And the baker just put in his order for his oils, and that's what they sent him. And if I hadn't been there to check it out, who knows if they would have gone ahead and used it. So it is part of this, the supervision is necessary when you get into large scale operations that they have in the modern world. Go back a few centuries, and then it was a much different kind of situation. And the local rabbi would be responsible, but usually he was the one who had to decide if the chicken was kosher or treif, because they slaughtered it and they brought it to the rabbi. He says, "Rabbi, is this chicken kosher? It's got this wrong with it, that wrong with it," and he would have to know how to make that answer. Most rabbis today wouldn't know what to do with a chicken if you brought it before them. I'm talking about my Orthodox colleagues because that's not something they really deal with on a regular basis. I'll end with 2 stories. Both of them are relatively famous. The first one is this: there's a rabbi in a small village in Eastern Europe back when, and 2 ladies came to him with chickens. And the first lady came in with chicken and said, "Is it kosher?" And the rabbi looked at it and he looked at it. If you go one way or the other, it's a question. He saw she was a poor woman. And if he said the chicken was not kosher, there goes her Shabbos meal. So he said it's kosher. Second lady comes in, shows him a chicken. He's got the same issue. But she's a rich woman. If he says it's not kosher, she can go back to the butcher and buy another chicken. So he said it wasn't kosher. And when his wife asked him about it, he explained it. Here's the poor woman. If I tell her it's not kosher, she's not going to have chicken for Shabbos. The rich lady, if I tell her it's not kosher, so she'll buy another chicken. She'll have her chicken for Shabbos. Okay. Now, you can only do it because there was area of doubt. If it's clearly not kosher, then he couldn't have said even to the poor woman that was kosher. But since there was doubt, in one case, it was okay to go ahead and use it because she didn't have the wherewithal to buy more. In the other case, it goes to waste, which is a shame, but she can still buy more. Okay? The other is more of a humorous one. Story goes, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a belief that the consumption of pork was helpful for people who had tuberculosis. And there was a Jewish man who had come down with tuberculosis, and he went to the doctor, and the doctor says, "You've got to eat ham, pork." So he's from Jew, goes to the butcher, and he says, the doctor says, no, goes to the rabbi, to the rabbi, the doctor says, "I have to eat the steak from a pork shop." Rabbi says that's what you have to do to save your life. You have to do it. But the shaychet, the butcher, has to kill the pig. So he goes to the butcher and he says, "The Rebbe said that you have to shech the pig for me so I can have a pork chop, because the doctor says I have to eat a pork chop in order to, deal with my tuberculosis." So the butcher says, the shaychet says, "Okay, goes to get the pig, and he takes a knife, and he takes a look at the knife, and is not sure if it's kosher or not, the knife, if there's a nick in it. So he goes to the rabbi, shows the rabbi the knife. He says, "Rabbi, is this knife kosher to shecht with?" And the rabbi says, "For a pig, it's kosher." Okay. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, God willing, we'll see each other next week. Please give me a few minutes time. If I hope I won't be late, and if I know for sure I'm late, I will try to send an email to you. Was there any other questions?
Yeah, sorry, I had one question.
Sure.
So I think I already know the answer from how you've explained everything today, but throughout all of Jewish history, what have Jews done in terms of hunting in situations where no animal husbandry was possible?
Well, Jews,
and you had to hunt.
Okay. First of all, trapping was always permitted. It talks about using nets. I don't, the fact of the matter is really in the biblical period, who knows? Okay, we know that they hunted and stuff. The mentioning about hunting, shooting, using bows and arrows, but there's no clear-cut message there. And even the whole idea of shechting the animal, kosher slaughter, is derived from the way they slaughtered animals in the temple. Okay, it never says anything in the Torah itself exactly how you're supposed to slaughter the animals. So we can't be sure of that period. I mean, it's almost, of course, they kept kosher, so they had to do it that way. We do know that there's agricultural societies, they didn't have a lot of meat to consume to start with. Meat was a rarity. Most of the time they had meat was when they brought a sacrifice. If you look up in ancient cultures, agrarian societies, for the most part, they didn't eat much meat. If either was a draft animal, which was more important to use to plow and pull wagons than to slaughter it. Furthermore, if you slaughtered it, you had to eat it right away because there's no way of preserving it very long. So consumption of meat was very low. And in those communities, if they had no domesticated animals to slaughter, they didn't eat meat. In the Middle Ages, and especially late Middle Age, early modern period, questions came up about Jews who were working with nobility or wealthy people who would go hunting. Were they allowed to hunt with them? Some rabbis permitted it, but not for consumption. Others said, no, you're not allowed to go hunting at all. And there even some dispute about going fishing. Fortunately, I follow those who say you're allowed to fish, but not that I fish very often. But there even were some who were opposed to fishing. And catch and release would be a question. Catch and release fishing becomes an issue because you're catching the animal and not eating it. And is that tsar balechaim, causing unnecessary harm and injury to an animal just for your own sport? And that I went to. Oh, one thing I didn't touch upon, and that is the case of veal. Many of my colleagues today will not consume veal because of the way the animals have to be raised in order to keep the meat light and white for veal production is considered by many authorities to be really tsar balechaim, unnecessary suffering on the part of the animal. So my family, we don't consume veal. Right? I'm not saying that's not, I wouldn't paskin for anybody that way, but I'm just saying that's what we do. Okay? All right, ladies and gentlemen, God willing, next week. Bye.